What's up guys, Damian here. So last week, the major labels, the publishing companies, and some of the biggest artists in the world penned a letter to the music industry and the music world saying it's time to down tools. It's time to keep your social distancing and stop worrying so much about the music, that the music industry will still be there in a couple of weeks or months' time, but now is not the time. We are in a time when a fifth of the entire world is on lockdown. We've lost every gig, every tour, and every festival for the foreseeable future. But on the plus side, it has stopped the return of the Westlife comeback tour. Every cloud. Musicians from all over the world have lost all of their work and all of their gigs, and the music industry has been put on hold until further notice. But this isn't the first time the music industry has collapsed. There have been many disasters that the music industry has bounced back from. So today, let's look at 5 times the music industry collapsed and had to be rebuilt. The year was 1982 and album sales were falling fast. It was such a bleak time that CBS laid off 300 people, and on August the 12th will go down in history as a day that we call Black Friday. Now CBS at this point were big players. They were a big deal. In fact, they were responsible for 25 of the top 100 selling records of all time. So these guys were major players, but at this time they had to close down offices in Denver, Detroit, Philadelphia, and they had to move their head offices to Washington. And at this point, 84% of all albums made by CBS weren't even recouping the costs. Therefore, they were in dire straits. But this wasn't a one company problem. No. Album sales had been dropping steadily since 1979 by up to $500 million per year. And Capitol Records had shut down a third of its pressing plants. Now, the reason for such a massive drop consistently year on year is because of the introduction to cassette tapes, allowing a lot more piracy in music. And on top of that, the introduction to computer games, meaning the computer game industry was growing. In fact, it made $5 billion that year. Now, the drop in both singles and album sales didn't just have a detrimental effect on the physical side of the music industry, but also the touring side, as musicians and artists were struggling to tour as much as they used to do. The dwindling sales in singles and albums meant lack of promotion, and therefore only smaller gigs were able to be played by some of the biggest artists in the world. This was a bleak time for the music industry. But 6 months later, in 1983, the whole music industry had bounced back bigger and better than ever. And why was that? One word: Thriller by Michael Jackson. Thriller is still the biggest selling album of all time, having gone 28 times platinum and sold over 50 million copies of that album worldwide. Michael Jackson single-handedly saved the music industry. Not only that, but at the time, MTV had a white acts only policy until the head of CBS, Walter Nietnikoff, said, hey, if you don't take Michael Jackson and play Michael Jackson, then you won't get any more CB artists at all. So they literally changed history. Not long after that came the resurgence of the music industry with the introduction of the CD. Printing costs and distribution costs became cheaper, and therefore the music industry became a one-stop printing press for money. Fast forward to 1999. In fact, it was December 1st, 1999. It was the last day of the year and the last day of the millennium, and the panic was real. Down to Y2K, the millennium bug, which was basically a coding problem for all computer software that all of the experts said meant that all the planes are going to fall out of the sky and we are going to have some world disasters and catastrophic events on our hands. Effectively, the software would fail, meaning hospitals, power plants, and airports would destroy us all. And we all waited and we watched as it led up to midnight. And the first problems were in Japan, where 2 nuclear power plant reactors, their systems went down and we weren't able to tell whether the world was about to go nuclear. Then Russia fired 3 Scud missiles at Chechnya. And the US panicked and said, "What's going on? What are you doing?" But it just turns out that Russia were being their crazy ass selves blowing shit up on New Year's Eve. So while we watched, TV became a countdown to extinction, Megadeth quote, instead of a countdown to celebration. And meanwhile, the stockpiling of food had begun and we were back in the lack of toilet roll one more time. The US spent $300 million preparing for what it thought could be a world catastrophe. And we watched and we waited. And then midnight came around. And do you know what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was the biggest anticlimax since the series of Lost finished and we realized they were all dead. Spoiler alert. How does that possibly affect the music industry? Well, let me tell you, because at the time the music industry was doing just fine and everyone was getting gigs and all the musicians were playing. In fact, because this wasn't just a New Year's Eve, this was the Millennium New Year's Eve. So every gig was starting to get hiked up in price. So musicians started to push their prices up. They started to go to £2,000 a gig instead of £1,000. They started to go to £3,000 and £4,000. And the stories of myself and my friends who were getting these crazy gigs for stupid amounts of money. It wasn't just double time or triple time. It was 5 times your normal pay. We were all going to get paid so much that we might not even have to work for the rest of the whole year. But the reality was, with supply and demand, ticket prices wouldn't sell because nobody could afford the bands to come in and play and then justify a ticket price of hundreds of dollars, even with the end of the world looming. So one by one, musicians that I know and musicians around the world started to lose their gig. Now, New Year's Eve for most musicians is the biggest night of the entire year. It's usually the best payer, but it's usually one night that you can guarantee that you can be working and making a decent amount of money leading into January and February, which is usually pretty dead. And the panic grew because of Y2K and the Millennium Bug. And one by one, everyone's gigs started to drop off. Musicians started to lose their gig all over the world. In fact, in 20 years of playing, I only had 2 New Year's Eves where I didn't have a gig, and one of those was by choice and the other one was on the Millennium. That New Year's Eve went from being the most played date of the entire year to a complete and utter shutdown for most musicians. And what did we do? We all went home and watched Jools Holland's Hootenanny. It was a stark reminder of supply and demand. If you try and push your prices up too much, in the end, it will break, people will snap, and you will be left without a gig. February 2001, and Napster killed music sales. Now, in 2020, music's free. We can get music on Spotify and Deezer and Apple and YouTube. In fact, we can get any song that we've ever wanted to listen to at the touch of a button in our pockets. But going back just 20 years, that wasn't the case. You physically had to go and buy the music in order to put it in something to play it. Music at that time was pretty much only physical. But since the late 90s, there has been a way that you can download music. The problem was, it would take you up to 12 to 14 hours to download your favorite Chili Peppers songs, and most of the time you'd wake up the next morning to find out that it had failed and you'd have to start again. So it just wasn't worth the effort. But Napster was different because instead of hosting the file on a server, Napster allowed you to dip into other people's hard drives to effectively steal that piece of music. Between May and October saw 4 million songs being downloaded, and by March the next year, 2000, 20 million songs were being downloaded. Labels panicked, as did artists, and some artists like Metallica and Dr. Dre took the fight to Napster and decided to launch a lawsuit for breach of copyright. But this was a grey area because the music wasn't being hosted on a server. So Napster was saying, you can't blame us because we're not hosting the music. We are not in breach of that copyright. And because of that grey area, the legal fight for Napster was turned to the people, and people who were downloading on Napster were getting hefty fines. People were downloading a couple of albums and getting thousands of dollars fines just to be made an example of, to stop this spreading around the world. But by this point, the music industry was in freefall, and the golden age of selling music was coming to an end. In 2000, 1 billion CDs were sold. Now, if you compare that to being halved just 6 years later, and in 2019, 46 million CDs were sold, less than 5%. And then in 2001, it all came crashing down, but with one stipulation. Napster was to be closed down, but had 48 hours to close its doors, which meant the world got online and started to download everything. 57 million people in some kind of music supermarket sweep. So on that Monday morning, Napster closed down, but there was a bigger problem, which was the world wasn't prepared to pay for music the same way that it once did. Those doors had been busted down like Jean-Claude Van Damme needing a shit and kicking down a toilet door. But while CDs had died, we were about to see the emergence of the iPhone and the music industry that we are now in, with streaming, downloads, Spotify, Deezer, Apple, and also YouTube. So fast forwarding a couple of years to 2008, and in music terms, this was the single biggest disaster that befell the music industry in its history. On June 1st, 2008, a fire started on the roof of Universal Studios after some maintenance had been done to fix that roof. But whilst the workers left, the roof was still hot, and 40 minutes after they'd gone, it caught fire and it started to rip through building after building. Universal Studios is a film studio in LA. In fact, it's the oldest and best known film studio in the world. And it's home to hotels and theme parks and sets from films from across the last 50 to 60 years. But as well as that, it was also home to some secret vaults of the UMG archive. Those archives held the masters to films and music dated back since the 1940s. So while the fire spread to the vaults, it took hours to put it out, and by the time they had, most of its contents was damaged or probably burned without recognition. Thousands and thousands of reel-to-reels and masters from some of the most famous songs, albums, and films of all times were gone. Entire discographies were wiped out. In fact, entire label back catalogs were all wiped out. And it was estimated that over 500,000 song titles had been burned. Financially, the loss was estimated to be around $150 million, but the history and the tradition was so much more. Losing the masters of the greats like Aretha Franklin and B.B. King, Chuck Berry, but also Eminem, John Lee Hooker, so many of these massive artists were now gone when it came to their masters, and it was every genre and every generation that was affected. Now, UMG is the biggest label in the entire world. Not long ago, it bought 50% of Sony Music, and it's valued at over $40 billion. Now, you can still hear all of these songs on Spotify, so they haven't been wiped off the planet. So what's the big deal? Well, the music industry is a business of copying. That's what it is. It's a copying business. We make copies of masters, but nowadays we make copies of copies of copies. And there are countless numbers of songs on Spotify that have actually been ripped off MP3s, which are nowhere near the masters. It's like taking a photo of a photo. Every single time you're going to get a slight degradation. It's not going to be quite the same. Imagine taking a photo of the Mona Lisa. Or what about if you're at a gig and you take a video of what's happening? It's just not quite as close as you being at that gig. The master is the purest form. It's the closest thing to being in that room when it was recorded. It's the closest thing to being at that gig at that time. Now, it means we can tweak stuff, but we can't discover magic that was once on that track that was recorded. We can't go back into that reel-to-reel and start listening to all the individual tracks the same way as we could when we had that master reel-to-reel. Nowadays we record everything digitally, so normally there's some kind of backups, but back then there weren't. So they're lost forever. It was such a shame. It was such a moment in time and something that the music industry will always look back at its biggest disaster. But on March 14th, 2011, something far more heinous and disastrous was about to happen to the music industry. Something we would never, ever recover from. For on that day, Rebecca Black released the track Friday. Which brings us up to today. The thing that shall not be named. Now, we are not fully through this, but we are already seeing devastating effects across the music industry. Possibly and probably the worst effect on the music industry that has ever been. We have seen some of the biggest companies in the world like Live Nation and AEG lose billions off their bottom line. We have lost tours all over the world and musicians have lost their income and their livelihood. Nobody as yet knows the full financial repercussion, but musicians can't gig. There's no gigs, there's no weddings, there's no cruises, there's no festivals, there's no venues open. So right now the music industry is on pause, if not shut down until further notice. Financially, this looks to be the worst disaster that has ever hit the music industry with regards to the people in it. And yes, the music slump in 1982 was a nightmare, but something we could get out of. And the UMG fire was heart-wrenching, but this affects every musician all over the world. We don't yet know what this means for the music industry or what the music industry will look like when we come out the other side. But what we do know is that we need to live to fight another day. And we do know from looking through history that the music industry has had plenty of ups and downs. It's had plenty of disasters and it's bounced back stronger every single time. Right now, it's an anxious time for everyone in the world. So us as musicians need to be sensitive to that. We need to do what we do best. We need to entertain. We need to be there to bring that distraction to people all over the world so we can all get out of this and play the long-term game. When we do come out of this the other side and the music industry is changed probably forever, we will know that we lived through it and we'll be stronger because of it. As creatives, we know that we can adapt to this market, and whilst it's going to be a fight, we will come out the other side. So guys, now is the time to create and entertain and look after a world that needs you. And I will be here if you need me. Just leave your comments down below. But thank you so much for watching. If you can do me a favor, like, subscribe. More importantly, come and be a part of this community where we're doing this every day. And I'm so proud of you guys and what you're going through and what you're creating at the moment. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.